And if there isn't something that's critically you're solving for a pain or you're solving for a job to be done, like a net benefit, then why are we here? And I think that's why oftentimes you'll see a marketplace maybe not find the right fit is they think that there's a there, and there's just not a willingness to pay.
Welcome to Partner Path, a podcast that unpacks the venture capital and growth equity ecosystem from a junior perspective. Young entrepreneurs and investors have already had a massive impact on the industry, having started unicorns and launched billion-dollar funds. We discuss these success stories and more by sharing perspectives and advice from some of the industry's most prominent role models. This podcast expresses our views as of the date published and does not represent the views of and is not endorsed by any company for which we work.
We're excited to sit down with Luke Skertich, a principal at FJ Labs. Luke comes from an entrepreneurial family and started as a pre-med student before working for 3 startups after college. Post-MBA, Luke joined FJ Labs in New York. FJ Labs is an early-stage venture capital firm focused on marketplaces, having invested in over 900 companies, which include Alibaba, Flexport, Delivery Hero, ShipBob, and more. Welcome, Luke.
Hey, thanks for having me. What an intro.
Well, let's go back to pre-venture days. What was your initial career path?
Sure. So initially, I intended to be pre-med, as you mentioned. Both of my parents work in healthcare, or now my dad is retired, so worked in healthcare. So naturally, I was pretty interested in the field, and actually neither of them were a doctor. So my mom did physical therapy, my dad did orthotics. And so when I said, hey, I want to do medicine, I think that got a little bit of an excitement, and then they started to push me towards exploring that field. And so the first experience I had really was in an academic research setting, Northwestern. So their pulmonary and critical care unit, I worked for a summer going into senior year of high school, and then stuck with them for another couple of summers still while in college. And when I went to University of Illinois, I worked in a chemical engineering research lab, specifically doing research on hematopoietic stem cells, which is taking a step back. It's just think of it as leukemia research. So how do the very earliest cells differentiate to eventually become cancerous versus bone marrow or something that it should have been intended to become? And so that was obviously a very far cry from eventually doing venture. But really, eventually I got to a point where I was like, is this what I want to do? Do I want to continue down the research path and eventually medicine? And that led to some questions with career path.
It's interesting because you have this healthcare background, but you also have this entrepreneurial background, just with like your mom starting a business, your dad being a solo founder as an orthotist, and then grandpa building a sporting store. So did you ever have the itch to start something outside of healthcare?
Oh yeah. My first business, I had a lemonade stand and a hot chocolate stand. I had a little red wagon, and we lived on a park. So it was the perfect business. Like there were baseball games, soccer games. I would take my little cart out there and I'd sell away, and my economics were perfect. I had zero costs because I went and raided my parents' fridge or the cabinet, and it was all profit. So no, jokes aside, so that was, I guess, like my first experience. The whole reason I did an MBA was to go find co-founders. And then ironically, maybe similar to starting with pre-med, I ended up in a completely different area. And so I think that the reason for that was I got about halfway through in one class in particular, I remember specifically I took because I wanted to know how VCs were going to value my business that I eventually was going to start. And I started to think about, wow, it's really cool the way that VCs work with founders. Instead of just having one idea and you're saying, this is all I'm going to do, you have the opportunity to work with and learn from a ton of different people and help to hopefully actually inflect the business. And I honestly, I think outside of the realm that we're stuck in so much, like VC and, okay, is this valuation improving or not? Entrepreneurship generally is a lot different than I anticipated. There's an entrepreneurial spirit, so to speak, in large corporations. A lot of people who I've worked with, like they might be at an Amazon, but that doesn't mean you're still not an entrepreneur at heart. And so I think there's just many more opportunities than I anticipated, and that can come on the side as well. When I was still living in Chicago, I worked on a junior board for Easter Seals, which is an organization that helps children with disabilities to get the services they need. And so that's another opportunity where maybe you're not starting a company, but you're helping to create a better situation for the board and fundraising and all these other things.
I'm curious, I feel like another way to still work with companies is like your involvement today. Are you pretty involved with the portfolio companies? I can imagine having 900 plus and not sure how many are active. It's probably a bit challenging to be involved in all of them.
Yeah, we certainly don't promise that we're going to be super hands-on to begin with. Actually, more so the opposite. We say we're not going to be very prescriptive. We're not going to be as hands-on as maybe some of your other VCs. But what that looks like is when they do need help, and primarily our bread and butter is fundraising, but primarily outside of that, we could say, look, when there is a question about geo expansion, okay, well, naturally you should talk to Fabrice or Jose, who have grown businesses to, with OLX, Fabrice grew to 30 countries. So clearly he knows that playbook. If you want to talk about marketing, you should probably talk to William, who's a venture partner on our team and was the CMO at OLX. If you want to talk product, then hopefully I'm a good fit. There's very different skill sets across the team that we can always plug somebody in. Taking it a step further, though, you naturally have companies that you really gel with the founder, or you can offer a lot more in terms of help, and then you'll spend more time with them.
That makes sense. Now, transitioning fully to the VC mode, you started at M25 as a summer associate. We're big fans of the fund, and Victor, who's the general partner over there, we actually brought him on as a guest. And then that position led you to FJ Labs, where you've been for the last 3.5 years. So, can you just touch on, at a high level, the founding story of FJ Labs and why focus only on marketplaces?
The founding story is really interesting. Fabrice and Jose were both serial entrepreneurs. So Fabrice, for his part, built, sold, scaled multiple companies. You can go back to the first one, Auckland, which was an eBay model for Europe, He built Zingy, which was a ringtone marketplace here in the US. He did OLX, which was a classifieds for emerging markets. And then Jose had a similar experience with a business called Deramate. That was an eBay model for Latin America. And so that's how they originally connected, actually, is over that shared appreciation and similar model playing geo arbitrage. And then fast forward to them having their large exits, Deramate joining forces with Mercado Libre, and then with OLX being sold to Naspers, they started to angel invest quite a bit. And I think, of course, it started while they were still operators, but they got to a point where they had invested in over 150 businesses together. And they were approached actually by our first LP, and they were like, you guys seem to be doing some pretty cool stuff. They wanted to learn about marketplaces. They're like, we can invest alongside you. They're like, okay, great. Like, we never thought we were going to be fund managers necessarily, but that makes a lot of sense. And then that practice continued to build until, now we're on our third fund, a little bit under a $300 million vehicle, and primarily marketplaces because that's what they knew and had built. And then, of course, it expanded over time. So you think about fundamentally with marketplaces, you're most likely, unless you're a crypto-enabled marketplace, you're going to have some physical goods that you're transporting, right? And so supply chain and logistics are something that they knew well and then continue to get a little bit deeper on. Typically, you're going to do some sort of financing at some point, maybe as part of your playbook. So fintech is quite a large portion of our portfolio at this point. Same thing goes for insurance and so on. And so that's kind of how they started to spread out into different areas. And then maybe today you could say network effect businesses versus marketplaces for our core focus.
And I think that's a great preamble to the next topic. Is we just love to hear your definition of a marketplace. What attributes do you need to be considered a marketplace?
We could be somewhat loose with the term at times. Realistically, anywhere where you're facilitating a transaction, so there is supply and demand. But we see this everything from classifieds where you're legitimately just a listing, and then you're hoping somebody is going to come and say, hey, that's something I'm interested in, and how can I buy it? To vertical marketplaces, which we've done quite a bit of, to SaaS enabled, where truly you're starting with SaaS instead of starting with a marketplace, but you have a transactional component that you layer on top. So I think that maybe the term will become looser over time as well, or you just kind of look at it in a different way and try to say, look, truly there's a transaction to be facilitated.
And what are the different types of marketplaces in your mind? What we've looked at is there are B2B marketplaces, B2C, and B2B2C. I'm curious if you agree with those classifications, if there are other types of marketplaces, and maybe could you just explain the difference between the three or however many you see?
Honestly, it comes down to just how what's the best approach to eventually taking the transaction? So I think traditionally you had classifieds, like that was the very first iteration. So think Craigslist, and you put up a listing and hopefully somebody's interested. And then that started to kind of shift. Maybe one thread we can pull is the vertical marketplaces. So there's a famous image, which I'm sure you guys have seen, that pulls apart all of the different subsections in the classifieds that Craigslist had. And then each one of those became a massive marketplace in and of itself. Most of those, of course, because that was individuals listing, were B2C. At the same time, B2B marketplaces, I think, is something that we've spent quite a bit of time in, especially over the last couple of years, more recently, where one, there's just a very, very low degree of penetration of technology being used by some of these businesses, but two, really attractive economics typically. So you might suffer a little bit from a lower take rate, but typically you're going to have a pretty high AOV, better recurrence, and ideally, unless you're selling to long tail SMBs, you're going to have an easier time with retention because once you've made that sale in and you're properly working and you've gained some trust, it's a lot harder to remove yourself from the process. And then you get into these other areas that we've talked about, which is like SaaS enabled marketplaces. You could talk about API enabled marketplaces. I'm happy to dig in. One of my colleagues did a thought piece on crypto enabled marketplaces. And I think that's then just like the hook of what's the best way. In the API side, it might be to aggregate supply up front and define an industry schema. For SaaS, it's like, okay, what do you not love to do? I'll give you the tools to do that stuff. And then you get to do the things you love, and then we'll own the transaction. So it just depends on what that iteration looks like. And I'm sure that as time goes on, we'll see a lot more different iterations. Oftentimes, what we find is a follower function of something that's been done in the SaaS world, and then you see marketplaces continue to adopt that.
Digging into the actual attributes of a marketplace, obviously starting a SaaS business is difficult. You have to generate demand for a product that you're actually creating. You almost think that starting a marketplace is twice as difficult because you have to not only drive demand on the product side, but also the supply, right? You have to drive both sides of the engine. I almost think of it as like starting a lawnmower. And once you get it going, then there can be flywheel effects, but it's a little more difficult to get off the ground. So I'd love to hear, in your view, what does it take to build an effective marketplace from the ground? What do you look for in startups that are just getting off the ground?
First of all, I need to take that lawnmower analogy. That's awesome. Second of all, okay, so I think it starts with the problem that you're solving for, right? So if you think about this either in terms of a problem set and is this a pervasive problem and is it super painful? Or the opposite way to look at it, maybe being like a jobs to be done framework, what is actually the benefit to the supply and the demand side? And if there isn't something that's critically you're solving for a pain or you're solving for a job to be done, like a net benefit, then why are we here? And I think that's why oftentimes you'll see a marketplace maybe not find the right fit is they think that there's a there, and there's just not a willingness to pay, there's not a willingness for you to take a piece of the transaction, and how are you going to make it work? Oftentimes, to answer that, we find founders who are solving a problem that they themselves have experienced, and that can be in another business setting, that can be personally. I spoke with someone, a founder last night, who she was telling me that the reason she got into doing what they do, which is selling collectibles, is she had a stamp collection from her father that she was trying to get rid of. And so she experienced the problem herself, figured out that it was much bigger than she maybe imagined. And then ultimately it was like, okay, stamps weren't the right entry point, something else. But that's kind of how you start to figure out, like, this is a unique insight that I have that somebody else does not have. The key is you start super small. Oftentimes there's this, I don't know if you'd call it mistake, but there's an easy excuse to look at a deck as an investor and be like, oh, this is a tiny market. Like I'm not interested. I'm going to pass. I think oftentimes we look at things almost the opposite way. If there's something that's an interesting niche, you can start small. You start with like seeding this atomic network, so to speak, whether that's by geo or by factor or by vertical that you're attacking. And then you can ultimately expand from there. Why go into say I'm going back to that collectible example, like why start with baseball cards if I know that there's another 20 people trying to do the same thing? Maybe I start with Magic the Gathering instead, and there's a much more passionate group of people who want to make purchases. And then eventually I go into this other thing.
So, I mean, in terms of verticals that maybe have been overdone or there's no room for innovation, I mean, are there any that come to mind? Marketplaces are interesting where it is one of those spaces where there can't be a bunch of winners. For example, if you're creating a marketplace for, like, I saw an interesting one the other day and it was equipment for actors and like when you're filming movies or like in production. And so I think that would be a challenging market to have multiple winners. So that's why I'm curious if there's any marketplaces that have just been overdone.
I don't want to say that there are any that are overdone, and then a founder will be like, "But Luke, you told me that this was a space that's terrible." But what I will say is we do look at that when we're thinking about investment. So say that I'm a pre-seed company, we will look at the competitive landscape, of course. And if you see that there's 5 players that are all Series B and beyond that have 50 million in the bank, we really need to figure out like what's the why now and why would we invest in the pre-seed company versus the others that have a very heavy balance sheet and a decent head start. There's probably no space that's necessarily completely exhausted itself. There's always going to be innovation, and it's a matter of what is that, maybe going back to the unique insight that you have, and then how do you create a moat out of it.
Yeah, and maybe looking at certain qualities too. There's probably qualities in your head that make a marketplace more attractive than other qualities, I'm assuming. We're kind of skipping on a little bit because you had a good transition into the bottom section of our questions. But in terms of like attractability, because I'm sure that there's certain qualities of a marketplace that you really look for that are more attractive than others. What does make a marketplace attractive to you or FJ Labs?
I think it depends on what you're looking at a little bit, like type of marketplace perhaps. I've talked or said the word transaction a lot of times, and I think maybe peeling that a layer further is a lot of it has to do with the economics of the business. So everything flows through the economics. And when you think about how I start, it's like, okay, now first I'm going to look at what the AOV is. Then I'm going to peel back the layer and see where is my take rate. Based on that, what does my margin look like? Okay, now what is my go to market? And that's extremely important because it'll tell me what my CAC looks like. Why does my CAC really matter? Because then I know what payback looks like, and do I get paid back on first transaction or not? And then from there, what is recurrence and retention? And so taking a look at each one of those individually, you can start to see why a marketplace can be very difficult to start. But if you find those kind of, I guess, indicators of success within the economics, then you can understand why, okay, now this is going to be a very sustainable, scalable business because the network effects start to kick in. And then it's very, very difficult for somebody else to come in and disrupt what I'm doing. Now, that's a little bit downstream of what we talked about earlier. If you're solving for a really painful problem or you're creating a very large net benefit, when you begin there and then you find that, okay, I believe that there is a there, then eventually the economics start to support that. Maybe not part of the question, but something that I think is interesting in marketplaces that's maybe not as true in SaaS necessarily is how typically we'll see CAC in terms of paid channels start to erode over time. And then for the the flywheel piece and the natural referral element start to help to prop up the marketplace. And so when we look at economics, we look at the paid CAC versus looking at blended, that we understand if something's not working today, it's probably not going to work in the future.
What I always struggle with marketplaces is we always like to run cohort analyses and try to like analyze repeatability. And sometimes it can be hard because you're placing transactions or orders like an ad hoc basis. So it's like trying to figure out which customers are actually coming back year over year. It's just not the same analysis as in like a typical SaaS, company.
You mentioned a couple of the metrics that you look at. I'm curious if there's one single metric that you look at to define the health of a marketplace, whether it's GMV, which is gross market value, I believe, which is just the AOV times the number of orders, or if it's the take rate, which is the rate at which you're actually generating revenue per transaction. So think Ticketmaster charging 8% on whatever the ticket cost would be their take rate. Is there like a specific metric that you guys really hone in on to determine whether it is an actual value creative scenario?
Oh man, if you're going to hold me to like one metric, I would either say CM2 or CM3, and that would mean contribution margin 2 or contribution margin 3. And so CM2 would be, what is your actual take, or what's your margin before you look at your paid CAC? And then for us, CM3 would be after paid CAC. So the reason I'd pick one of those two is I want to know that you're actually making money on a transaction. You look back at some models that we've seen in the past, delivery is a perfect example where you knew that going in, none of these businesses were actually even CM1 positive, really. This was a very difficult model where you weren't making money necessarily upfront. And so you had to take a very large bank account or get to a very large bank account and then hopefully bleed the others dry as you started to expand and win the market. Ideally, you don't continue to be in a ton of businesses that are super low margin, very difficult to scale because they're so capital intensive. You can maybe do decently if you're the winner, but really, really difficult if you want a basket of companies. So I would say, how do I understand that somebody either is profitable in some way, shape, or form, or will be eventually on a per transaction basis? And so, Laura, you mentioned at the start of your question, sometimes how do you look at that early on in the business? And the answer, like at pre-seed, is like you can't. Like you might be at a point where you've not even built the product yet. And so then something that we really try to dive in on and can be difficult at times is looking at the economics from day one. And I'm not going to hold a founder to what those economics actually will be necessarily, but that's one way that we can tell, is this someone who's operationally very strong? And is this somebody who's looked at the numbers and figured out based on all the comps where they think roughly things should look?
We'd love to shift focus to your focus areas. Recently, you've been spending a good amount of time in the next evolution of SaaS enabled and API enabled marketplaces. And so, starting off with grounding the group, why these two sectors?
Yeah. So with the API enabled side, I think partly just experience based. So the last startup that I worked for, Yellow, before I did MBA and transitioned into investing, I managed a P&L, which was essentially API integration, all of our data visualization wrapped up together. And so maybe in a way that helped from an interest perspective and then just seeing things, but it really didn't come until a pattern recognition, so to speak, where I talked to enough companies where I thought they were doing this that I was like, okay, I need to do more research. And then did about 5, 6 months of research and was like, okay, I think that this is validated and here's what I should look for. The same sort of thing happened with SaaS enabled, and in particular, looking at B2B marketplaces and thinking through, okay, what are these folks doing? Why am I seeing this so often? And then what's the next iteration? So that research is not complete, but hopefully to come by the end of the year.
Well, there's a few pieces that you've put out to the ecosystem that we'll share with the audience. And speaking of those pieces, what edge does that give a company to have that API enablement?
Okay. So on the API piece, similar to what I talked about before with like the way I guess I noticed this was seeing what SaaS businesses had done. So you could think through like verticalization of SaaS. You think of like collaboration, go to market using like product led growth. And then I thought I noticed, okay, some people are using API as an infrastructure from the start. That is super, super helpful for a handful of reasons. One, it helps you to aggregate supply. Again, typically better in B2B, because if you have an API, it's a lot easier for you to bring whatever information they have over from other sources. So that could be like an archaic ERP system, that can be something that's fairly new technology. But if you're thinking in terms of their catalog and what you can list, it becomes much easier for you to quickly onboard. The other advantage is it helps you to define the industry schema. And so when you do that, you have a more acute ability, so to speak, to find product market fit with less resistance. And the reason for that is because you're constantly iterating and saying, these are the right fields. I know that this is what I should be looking at. And then on top of that, because you're using an API approach, I can actually measure how often is my API getting hit, what fields are actually being completed across all of my clients. From there, the infrastructure is in place to say, all right, and we talked about natural evolution of marketplaces. Maybe I start with a SaaS and I'm just really trying to help the business to do listings. And then I start to own the transaction. And then I start to do insurance. And like it's very easy to start layering on all of these different services. And the same is true now when you think about like plugins from an AI perspective. So if I wanted to start with my API infrastructure and eventually use somebody else's search optimization, it'd be really easy to plug in the search because the infrastructure is in place. Same thing goes for pricing optimization. Same thing goes for you name whatever the problem is, and it's a lot easier to not have to build and instead buy. And I ran into that problem when I was in startup land as well. It's so often you can feel you can build better than you can buy. I'm of the opposite mentality now, where if I can buy something that's reasonably priced to start, as long as it's not the core of my business, do that until I learn enough and then I'll build it myself.
And I think before we wrap up, I don't think it would be a Partner Path episode without an obligatory mention of AI, which obviously you brought up. So with that, would love to hear a little bit more about what applications of AI are kind of changing the way that marketplaces operate, or are there specific marketplaces that are evolved around AI? What are the impacts that you're seeing?
It's the insight that businesses can gain from their data to offer a more personalized user experience. And if you offer a better user experience, you probably can also monetize better. Or maybe you don't monetize necessarily more from a take rate perspective, but you have somebody who's just like a raving fan that then comes back over and over and over again. The biggest challenge is choosing the right plugin for the business's unique needs and goals at the right time. And then it's easy sometimes to just build for the sake of building or build for the sake of getting yourself to more revenue. But I hope that people think a lot more about what is proprietary data, how is that kept safe, and then ensuring that there's nothing that's done improperly with the data. You asked for an example of somebody who's doing this right. It's not exactly a marketplace, but the way that we've looked at a lot of the AI side of things is like, how does it help marketplaces? And so Photo Room is one that we invested in over a year ago now. And what they do is they're an app to help improve images to sell items on effectively marketplaces. And so at first it was like, okay, I can take a picture of the coffee cup on my desk and it'll wipe the background clean. And I can now list with a white background. And then it continue to compound its data advantage and say, okay, well, I can put a wood background and I can put a shadow and I can do whatever depending on the item, very easily leveraging their tool. And at this point now, they're at a point where I could take a picture of my coffee cup and it would generate the listing effectively. Or I plug into their API and it can similarly show backgrounds for all of the things that are on my website. And so that's been really cool to see how they've evolved and then again, like use that data advantage to their products.
I do think it would be helpful to just for you to quickly define what a SaaS enabled marketplace is, because I'm honestly a little fuzzy on the definition.
To me, SaaS enabled marketplace is basically you start with a SaaS offering. So let's use the example of I am a psychologist and I have a practice and I need something that can help me manage my schedule, help me understand my caseload, my inbound, help me to continue to interface with any of my patients when we're between sessions. I oftentimes will probably start with that SaaS solution that truly is just like any B2B SaaS, so to speak. And then the marketplace piece is that transaction that you own that's bolted on top. And so that might look like, hey, I don't actually charge anything for the initial SaaS. And you start with just, I can do scheduling and case management. And then whenever I book somebody, automatically you pay through the platform and I'm taking 10% or whatever. I'm just making up a number. And then over time, maybe you do build out a lot more of the SaaS pieces because it helps from a practice management perspective. Okay, I help you to interface with insurance. Now I'm doing a lot more, hey, you can copy and paste certain things depending on whatever your patient is experiencing. Maybe I charge for those premium features. I've seen it the other way where people charge for the SaaS out the gate, and I typically recommend against it because I'd rather you get those early wins and get people using the platform, take the take rate, and then learn from there.
It's very, very helpful. And actually, one last question from me. Do you measure the recurring nature of transactions? Do you measure like typical gross net retention, or how do you track whether customers are coming back to the platform to make purchases on a recurring basis?
It depends. One way you can look at it is how often are you getting a transaction? And that might make sense if I'm selling physical goods. Maybe it's you're coming back every few months. That's okay. That's a good way to measure because a retention curve is only going to tell me so much in that case. You might look like a zero for a while. Of course, when you smooth that out across all of the customers in each cohort, you should be able to see, okay, not everybody's leaving. That looks a lot different if you're a highly transactional business. So by that, I mean, say I'm supplying the supplier, so to speak, like Odeco, for instance. They take the keys to your coffee shop, they come in at night, they're restocking your supply. It wouldn't make sense for me to be like, okay, I'm going to look at how recurrent their transactions are. It'd be more helpful for me to look on a monthly basis and then say, what does the GMV retention look like over time? I guess you'd liken it in a SaaS business to net dollar retention or NDR. And so then you want to see that growing over time because that tells me, okay, clearly that's a big cost center that you started with. And over time, you're taking more and more share of wallet of all those costs of, whatever it is that you need to run your business.
And then to wrap the episode, let's end with 2 questions. The first one is, what motivates you to work hard?
What motivates me at first was, I think, always like, I have a goal in mind and then I want to go achieve it. And so whether that's you make it to the next step in terms of career path, or you make it to a point where you've led more investments, or maybe if you want to sit on a board and very goal driven, that has super changed in the last 6 weeks because now I just want to do whatever I can to help my daughter, Cecilia, like have a better life than me. And so I think that's a very different driver of what makes me want to work hard. It's like less about me and more about her and hopefully more kids in the future.
Luke has a newborn, everyone. So
Congrats. Congrats.
Yeah. Thank you.
And then what's a piece of advice you'd give your younger self?
I had this great advice given to me once by an engineering manager I worked with, this guy, Ed, who was fantastic. And he said to me, every year, I think about what I want to learn and what I want to accomplish. And then I think about, can I do that in the place that I currently am? And by that, he means the company that he's currently working for. And his advice was basically, if you don't think that you can do it where you are, you don't have like some degree of confidence, then you just leave and you go and you find the next thing. Now, of course, like, don't just be like, okay, I'm going to quit one day. But I found that to be really insightful. And I think it forces you, some people do this maybe on more of like a quarterly basis versus a yearly basis, but it forces you to say, what is it that I really want? And that is easy to think about when you hit a new year of like, okay, new year, what I want to look for. And then if you can't find it, okay, I'm just going to have the confidence to go somewhere else where I think I can.
That's a great piece of advice. Yeah, Luke, thanks so much for coming on. I personally have learned a ton. I think this is a great primer on marketplaces. And so we both appreciate you coming on and sharing your advice and perspectives.
Of course. Thanks for having me. Super appreciate it.